Outside Thaddius Bell's ranch, 6 young women had dropped to their knees in the dusty earth. Tears and grime marked their faces with streaks of desperation. The man from whom they sought assistance, however, had maintained complete silence from all human contact for 3 full years. The request they were preparing to make would compel him to decide between his zealously protected isolation and something infinitely more perilous than his current loneliness. The merciless sun blazed overhead in the isolated valley, where Thaddius had constructed his fortress of quietude. As he gazed upon the unbelievable scene unfolding before him, his weathered fingers clutched the porch rail tightly. Against his endless fence boundary, 6 forms in ripped gowns knelt like damaged marionettes. The youngest appeared no older than 17, while the eldest might have reached 25. His throat felt parched as desert sand. 3 years had passed since any human voice other than his own had reached his ears, bouncing back from surrounding canyon walls. 3 years since he had consciously selected this way of life, severing all connections that had linked him to the world outside his property boundaries. The closest settlement required 2 days of dangerous travel through hazardous landscape. Nobody arrived at this location accidentally, yet here these women were. The woman with reddish-brown hair lifted her head initially. Desperation filled her emerald eyes, a look he recognized despite years of attempting to erase that expression from memory. When she attempted to speak, only a whispered rasp came forth. Her lips showed cracks. Her face appeared gone from weariness. Whatever circumstances had delivered them to his doorstep, they had journeyed far and endured tremendous hardship. Thaddius sensed his meticulously built defenses beginning to shake. Every survival instinct urged him to look away, to withdraw into his dwelling and act as though this encounter had never occurred. Hard experience had taught him that assisting others inevitably resulted in suffering. Trust had become a privilege beyond his means. The most secure position was solitary existence, perpetually alone, yet as the red-haired woman attempted to rise. Swaying precariously, something awakened within his chest, an emotion he had buried so profoundly that he had nearly persuaded himself of its death. The notion that perhaps escape was equivalent to safety. The woman advanced 1 step, her voice barely carrying across the space separating them. Her coming words would demolish the silence he constructed around himself like protective armor. Once uttered, no retrieval would be possible, for what she was about to reveal would show that his 3 years of seclusion had been insignificant compared to the decision now confronting him. As the auburn-haired woman spoke, her voice fractured, yet her words sliced through the desert atmosphere like a sharp blade. "Please, sir, we have nowhere else to turn. They are pursuing us." Thaddius's grip on the porch railing intensified, his knuckles becoming white against the sun-faded timber. Pursuing. This word awakened memories he had spent years suppressing. Visions of another woman, another frantic plea, another instance when he had chosen incorrectly. His jaw clenched with such force that pain shot through it. "You must depart," he responded, his voice hoarse from lack of use. "I cannot provide assistance." Even as these words escaped his lips, he observed details that twisted his stomach with fear. The woman's dress wasn't merely torn. It was shredded in ways that implied violence had occurred. Dark marks stained the material, some resembling dry blood. The remaining 5 women displayed similar evidence of brutal treatment. Whatever they fled from had already overtaken them once. The woman stumbled forward another step, pressing her hand against her side. When she withdrew it, Thaddius observed fresh blood seeping through her fingers. His breathing caught. She bore wounds, possibly severe ones. All of them appeared half dead from exhaustion and lack of water. "They seized our wagon 3 days ago," she continued, her voice weakening further. "They murdered our guide and threatened worse consequences if they captured us again. You represent our final hope, sir, the only person between this place and the border." Border. This word struck Thaddius like a physical assault. These weren't merely travelers experiencing difficulty. They were escapees. Whatever trouble accompanied them would become his burden the instant he provided them shelter. He had learned this lesson previously, and it had stripped him of everything meaningful. But watching the woman sway unsteadily, her complexion growing increasingly pale, something fractured inside him. She would collapse soon, as would they all. If he dismissed them now, he would be condemning them to death as certainly as if he had fired a weapon himself. The woman's legs gave way. She collapsed to her knees in the dirt, her blood now creating a visible stain in the dust below. The other women hurried to her assistance, forgetting their own frailty in their desperation to help their leader. Thaddius discovered himself descending the porch steps before his mind could process his body's actions. 3 years of isolation had instructed him in many lessons, but had destroyed the part of him incapable of witnessing human suffering. Not when he possessed the ability to prevent it. As he approached the group of women, however, a new sound reached his hearing. Hoofbeats, distant but approaching. Multiple horses moving rapidly across the hard desert ground. Someone approached, and they rode urgently. The auburn-haired woman detected it as well. Terror crossed her features as she grasped Thaddius's arm with blood-covered fingers. "They have located us," she whispered. "Dear Lord, they have found us." Thaddius looked toward the horizon where dust clouds rose in the distance. Whoever approached would arrive within an hour, and upon their arrival, they would discover 6 women clearly fleeing something, and 1 man about to learn that certain choices cannot be reversed. Thaddius's mind worked frantically as he calculated distances and possibilities. The approaching riders would reach his ranch in less than 60 minutes. 6 injured women couldn't outrun mounted men, particularly in their present state. Yet helping them meant destroying the refuge he had built through 3 years of careful isolation. "Bring them inside," he heard himself declare, the words feeling strange on his tongue. Immediately, the auburn-haired woman, who weakly identified herself as Clara, attempted to object. "We won't bring danger to your home, sir. We can conceal ourselves in the rocks." "You'll perish in the rocks," Thaddius responded bluntly. He was already moving, his survival instincts overriding 3 years of self-imposed withdrawal. "And those riders will discover your bodies by morning. Then they'll know someone assisted you." He lifted the weakest woman, a blonde, barely past girlhood who seemed to burn with fever, into his arms. Her weight astonished him. She was nothing but skin and bones, lighter than a grain sack. When had he last held another human being? The memory felt like touching fire. The other women supported each other as they stumbled toward his cabin. Thaddius noticed details that made his jaw clench with rage. Rope marks on their wrists, finger-shaped bruises around their throats. These weren't merely fugitives. They were victims. Inside the single-room cabin that had comprised his entire world for 3 years, the women collapsed onto whatever surfaces they could locate. The contrast was striking. His space, which had felt appropriately sparse for a man who wanted nothing from the world, now seemed painfully cramped and insufficient for 6 desperate souls. Clara pressed her hand more firmly against her wounded side as she examined the cabin. Her eyes took in the single bed, the minimal furnishings, the complete absence of anything suggesting a woman had ever resided here. "You live alone," she observed. It wasn't a question. "By choice," Thaddius replied, already moving to secure the windows. "And you're about to discover why." Through the gaps in the wooden shutters, he could see the dust cloud expanding. The riders were pushing hard, which meant they were either desperate to catch their quarry or confident they were close. Neither possibility suggested good fortune. "Who are they?" he asked Clara as he examined his rifle. The weapon felt unfamiliar in his hands after so long, but muscle memory was returning. Clara's face went ashen. "Slavers," she whispered. "They purchased us from a man who promised us employment in the territories, said we would be teachers and seamstresses." Instead, she gestured to her torn dress, her bruised throat. Ice formed in his veins. Slavers, the worst type of predator, those who viewed human beings as livestock for buying and selling, those who would kill anyone standing between them and their property. The hoofbeats were close enough now that he could distinguish individual horses. At least 6 riders, possibly more. Professional men who wouldn't be discouraged by a single rancher's defiance. As Clara struggled to stand, her face contorted with pain and determination, she said something that made Thaddius's blood freeze. "There's something else you must know, something that makes this worse than you imagine." Clara's following words struck Thaddius like a physical assault. "The man who sold us to the slavers, he's a federal marshal, badge and everything. His name is Wade Garrett." The rifle nearly fell from Thaddius's hands. A federal marshal. This changed everything. These weren't just lawless raiders he could repel with superior firepower. If a man with badge was involved, it meant the corruption extended deep, all the way to territorial authority. That's why we can't approach the law, Clara continued, her voice growing weaker as blood continued seeping between her fingers. Garrett has connections in 3 territories. Anyone we report to will hear about it first. Then we disappear permanently. Through the window, Thaddius could now distinguish individual riders cresting the ridge overlooking his valley. 6 men on horseback, moving with the confidence of hunters who had cornered their prey. One of them wore something that reflected the sunlight, a badge. Thaddius felt the familiar burden of impossible choices settling on his shoulders. Help these women and become a target himself. Turn them away and watch them die. Either path led to consequences he wasn't certain he could endure. "There's a root cellar," he said finally, his voice rough with decision. "Behind the cabin, under a false floor. It's where I store winter supplies. You can hide there." But Clara shook her head. "They'll search everywhere. These men are thorough. They've been tracking us for days, and they know their business." The youngest woman, the one with fever, suddenly spoke for the first time. Her voice was barely audible, but her words cut through the tension like a blade. "He's right to be frightened. We bring death wherever we go." Thaddius looked at her more closely and felt his heart skip. She couldn't be more than 16, with corn silk hair and blue eyes that held too much knowledge for someone so young. What kind of monsters sold children? The hoofbeats were close enough now that he could hear leather creaking, men calling to each other in low voices. They were spreading out, surrounding the ranch with military precision. Professional kidnappers who had done this many times before. "Listen to me," Thaddius said, his voice steady despite the chaos in his mind. "I need to know exactly what we're dealing with. How many men? What weapons? How far will they go?" Clara met his eyes, and he saw a depth of suffering that made his own 3 years of self-imposed exile seem like a vacation. "They'll burn this place to the ground if they have to. Kill anyone who stands in their way. These aren't men with consciences, sir. They're devils in human skin." Through the shutter slats, Thaddius caught his first clear glimpse of the lead rider. The man sat his horse like he owned the world, his badge catching the light as he surveyed the ranch buildings. Even at a distance, Thaddius could see the cold calculation in his posture. This was Wade Garrett, the federal marshal who sold human beings for profit. If you were Thaddius, what would you do? Stand and fight against impossible odds, knowing you'd likely die but might save 6 innocent lives? Or find a way to negotiate, potentially saving yourself but possibly dooming the women to a fate worse than death? Tell me in the comments. I need to know which side you'd choose, because what Thaddius decided next would determine whether anyone in that cabin would live to see another sunrise. The riders had stopped just outside rifle range, close enough to communicate, but far enough to avoid immediate danger. Garrett raised his voice, and his words carried clearly across the desert air. "Afternoon, friend. We're looking for some runaway property. 6 women who stole themselves from their rightful owners. You seen anyone like that around here?" Thaddius stepped onto his porch, rifle held loosely in his hands, but ready. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the yard as he faced down 6 mounted men who radiated menace like heat from a forge. Marshal Garrett sat his horse in the center, his badge gleaming against a black vest that had seen too much blood. "Haven't seen anybody," Thaddius called back, his voice carrying the flat tone of a man accustomed to solitude. "Don't get many visitors out here." Garrett's smile was cold as winter stone. "That's so? Mind if we take a look around? Sometimes folks hide in places they think nobody will find them." Behind Thaddius, inside the cabin, he could hear the faint sound of the women trying to muffle their breathing. Clara had grown silent, probably unconscious from blood loss. The youngest was still burning with fever. None of them were in any condition to run, even if there was somewhere to go. "This is private property," Thaddius replied, "and I don't recall inviting you to search it." One of Garrett's men, a scarred brute with dead eyes, spat tobacco juice into the dust. "Federal authority trumps private property. Hermit, you got something to hide, or you just naturally unfriendly?" Thaddius felt sweat beading on his forehead, despite the desert heat. These men weren't here to negotiate. They'd already decided he was hiding something. The only question was how far they'd go to prove it. Funny thing about hermits, Garrett said, dismounting with fluid grace. They usually choose isolation because they got secrets. What's your secret, friend? The marshal took a step closer, his hand resting casually on his pistol grip. See, we've been tracking those women for 3 days. Lost their trail about a mile from here, right where the hard ground starts. Now, I'm thinking a smart man might have helped them cover their tracks. Question is, why would he do that? Thaddius could feel the moment balanced on a knife's edge. Behind him, one of the women made a soft whimper of pain. It was barely audible, but in the desert silence, it might as well have been a scream. Garrett's head tilted slightly, like a wolf catching a scent. What was that? Wind, Thaddius said quickly, loose board in the roof. But Garrett was already moving, drawing his weapon with practiced smoothness. Boys, I think our hermit friend's been keeping secrets. Why don't we have us a proper look inside? The other 5 men dismounted in unison, their movements coordinated and efficient. These weren't random thugs. They were professionals who'd done this many times before. Thaddius realized with cold certainty that talking his way out was no longer an option. As Garrett stepped onto the porch, his boots creaking against the weathered wood, he spoke in a voice that promised violence. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to step aside, and we're going to collect our property. Anyone who interferes gets buried in the desert where nobody will ever find them. If you're enjoying the story, subscribe to the channel. But as Garrett reached her cabin door, Thaddius made a choice that would change everything. The choice that had been building since the moment he'd seen 6 desperate women kneeling in his yard. Thaddius raised his rifle in one smooth motion, the barrel coming to rest inches from Garrett's chest. The marshal froze, his hand still reaching for the door handle, his eyes widening with surprise and calculation. I said this is private property, Thaddius repeated, his voice deadly calm. And I meant it. For a heartbeat, the world held its breath. 6 guns were suddenly trained on Thaddius from the yard below, but his rifle never wavered from Garrett's heart. The marshal's face cycled through emotions, surprise, anger, and finally a cold respect. You're making a mistake, friend, Garrett said softly. A big one. Those women belong to us. Bought and paid for. You're interfering with legal commerce. Legal? Thaddius's laugh was bitter as alkali dust. Slavery's been illegal for years, Marshal. Even out here in the territories. Garrett's smile returned, thin and predatory. These ain't slaves, Hermit. They're indentured servants. Signed contracts and everything. They owe debts that need paying, and we're here to collect. Inside the cabin, Thaddius heard Clara's voice, weak but fierce. Lies. We never signed nothing. He drugged us, took us from a church social in Kansas. Garrett's face darkened at being overheard. Sounds like you got some stolen property in there, friend. Property that's causing you to make poor choices. The standoff stretched like a wire pulled too tight. Thaddius knew the mathematics of the situation. 7 armed men against 1, with 6 wounded women caught in the crossfire. Even if he killed Garrett, the others would cut him down before he could work the rifle's lever. But sometimes mathematics didn't matter. Sometimes a man had to make a stand regardless of the odds. Here's what's going to happen, Thaddius said, his voice carrying the authority of absolute conviction. You're going to get back on your horses and ride away. You're going to forget you ever saw this place or these women, and you're going to find yourself a new line of work. Garrett's scarred lieutenant shifted in his saddle, his gun hand twitching. Boss, just give a word. We can drop him and be done with it. But Garrett held up a hand, his eyes never leaving Thaddius's face. Something had shifted in the marshal's expression. He was seeing something he hadn't expected. A man who'd already made peace with dying. You know what I think? Garrett said slowly. I think you got history with situations like this. I think maybe you failed to help someone once before, and now you're trying to make up for it. The words hit like physical blows. Thaddius felt his carefully buried memories clawing their way to the surface. Another woman. Another desperate plea for help. Another moment when he'd chosen safety over courage and watched someone die for his cowardice. Touched a nerve, did I? Garrett pressed. What was her name? Wife, sister, daughter? Someone you let down when it mattered. Thaddeus's grip tightened on the rifle, but his aim never wavered. Her name was Sarah. She was my wife, and I won't make the same mistake twice. Garrett nodded as if something important had been confirmed. Sarah, pretty name. Bet she died screaming, knowing you were too much of a coward to save her. The rage that exploded in Thaddeus's chest nearly cost him everything. For a split second, his finger tensed on the trigger, ready to end Wade Garrett's life regardless of consequences. But in that moment of white-hot fury, he heard something that changed everything. Clara's voice from inside the cabin, barely a whisper, but carrying clearly in the desert air. That's his name, the man who killed your wife. The words hit Thaddeus like lightning striking twice in the same place. Wade Garrett, the name he'd spent 3 years trying to forget, the man who'd come to their homestead with promises of protection, who demanded Sarah as payment when Thaddeus couldn't meet his extortion fees, the man who'd laugh when Thaddeus begged for mercy, who'd taken Sarah anyway when he refused to fight. Garrett's eyes glittered with recognition and sick pleasure. Well, Thaddius Bell, the coward of Willow Creek. I wonder what happened to you after you ran away like a whipped dog. The rifle trembled in Thaddeus's hands, but not from fear. 3 years of guilt and rage focused into a single point of blazing hatred. You killed her. I didn't kill her, Garrett said with mock innocence. You did, by being too yellow to fight for her. She called your name when she died. You know, wondered where her brave husband had gone. Thaddeus felt something fundamental crack inside his chest. The careful walls he'd built around his grief, the rational explanations he constructed for his cowardice, the lies he'd told himself about having no choice. All of it crumbled at once. But here's the beautiful part, Garrett continued, his voice dripping with malicious joy. History is about to repeat itself. Except this time, instead of one woman, you got 6, and you're going to watch me take every single one of them, just like before. Behind Thaddeus, Clara's voice grew stronger, fueled by desperate fury. He's lying, Thaddeus, about your wife calling for you. Sarah Bell died fighting. I know because I was there. I was one of the women he took before her. The revelation hit like a physical blow. Thaddeus turned his head slightly, never taking his eyes completely off Garrett. What? Sarah Bell, Clara continued, her voice gaining strength despite her wounds. Blonde hair, blue eyes, scar on her left hand from a cooking accident. She fought like a wildcat when they took her, broke one man's nose, nearly took another's eye, and when she died, she wasn't calling for you. She was cursing Garrett's name. Garrett's confident smile faltered for the first time. Shut your mouth, woman. But Clara pressed on, her words carrying the weight of witnessed truth. She told me about you in the wagon, said you weren't a coward, said you promised to come for her, and she believed you would. She died believing you'd come. Thaddeus felt the world tilt on its axis. For 3 years, he'd carried the weight of cowardice, the certainty that he'd failed a woman he loved. But if Clara was telling the truth, I searched for weeks, he whispered, the words torn from his throat. Followed every trail, checked every town. But you were already gone. Garrett recovered his composure, but something had changed in his posture. He was no longer playing with a broken man. He was facing someone dangerous. Touching reunion, but it changes nothing. You still lost her, and you're about to lose again. The Marshal's hand moved toward his gun, but Thaddeus was already squeezing the trigger. The rifle's roar split the desert silence like thunder, and Wade Garrett flew backward off the porch, his chest blossoming red. Chaos erupted in the ranch yard as Garrett hit the ground. His 5 men opened fire simultaneously, bullets splintering the porch railing and shattering windows. Thaddeus dug behind a water trough, working his rifle's lever with practiced speed. The man who'd spent 3 years running from violence had remembered how to fight, but the odds were impossible. 5 professional killers against 1 rancher with 6 wounded women trapped in the crossfire. Thaddeus knew he had maybe 30 seconds before they overwhelmed his position. Then Clara appeared in the cabin doorway, clutching a shotgun she'd found inside. Blood stained her dress, But her hands were steady as she fired both barrels into the nearest rider. The man tumbled from his horse, screaming, "The root cellar!" She shouted over the gunfire. "There's more weapons down there." The other women emerged from the cabin like avenging angels, each carrying rifles or pistols from Thaddius' hidden arsenal. They were wounded, exhausted, barely able to stand. But they'd found something worth fighting for, their freedom and the first man in years who'd been willing to die for it. The gunfight that followed was brief but brutal. Caught between crossfire from the cabin and the porch, Garrett's remaining men broke and ran. 2 more fell before they reached their horses. The survivors rode hard for the horizon, leaving their dead behind. In the sudden silence that followed, Thaddius found himself kneeling beside Wade Garrett's body. The man who'd haunted his nightmares for 3 years was finally dead, but the victory fell hollow. Sarah was still gone. The years of self-imposed exile couldn't be undone. Clara knelt beside him, her own wounds forgotten. "She'd be proud of you," she said quietly. "Sarah, she'd be proud you finally fought back." Thaddius looked up at the 6 women who'd changed everything by refusing to accept defeat. Clara, bleeding but unbowed. The fever-sick girl who'd found strength she didn't know she had. For others whose names he didn't even know yet, but who'd stood with him when it mattered. "What will you do now?" he asked Clara. She smiled for the first time since he'd met her. "We talked about it while you were playing hero. There's a town 2 territories north that needs teachers. Good folks who won't ask too many questions about where we came from." "And you," she asked, "will you go back to hiding in this valley?" Thaddius looked around at his ranch, the place that had been both sanctuary and prison for 3 years. The silence he'd treasured now felt empty rather than peaceful. The solitude that had once protected him now seemed like another kind of death. "No," he said, surprised by the certainty in his voice. "I think I've been alone long enough." If you're enjoying the story, subscribe to the channel. 6 months later, a 1-room schoolhouse in the territory of New Haven welcomed its newest teachers. 6 women who'd learned that freedom was worth any price. Their friend Thaddius built the school with his own hands, crafting each desk and window frame with the same care he'd once used to build walls around his heart. Clara married him on a spring morning when the desert bloomed with wildflowers, and she wore Sarah's wedding ring with pride, knowing that some loves are strong enough to bless new beginnings. The fever-sick girl, whose name was Grace, grew strong and tall, becoming the finest teacher in 3 territories. And sometimes on quiet evenings when the wind was just right, Thaddius could swear he heard Sarah's voice in the desert breeze, telling him she was proud of the man he'd finally chosen to become. Now, click on the video on the screen to hear a story even better than this one, with a revelation so powerful it will stay with you long after the last word is spoken. Click on the video.